All right, I'm on.
Well, hey, man, I'm on. Welcome, everybody, to an episode of OTXNT. It has been, what, a month or so since we have done this.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, everybody.
Yeah,
It's
Andrew's
been a little while.
he's been on sabbatical, so you get to take a little break. It's all vacation for you, is what it's been, huh?
Yeah, just got the one job instead of the
That's
oh,
we
two instead
forget.
of the three, I guess is where I'm
Yes,
at. But yeah,
many jobs.
uh,
Uh,
but I'm
well,
excited. I'm excited. This is going to be good. We just trying to get our schedules lined. We're very busy, prestigious people.
that's right. That's
But
right.
I'm excited, and I guess you're the one taking the lead on the topic today.
You
What are
bet.
we going to talk about?
Well, first off, as you're listening, make sure you hit a like bell, subscribe, put a comment, a nice comment. We'll say the past week I've been bombarded, Andrew. I had a article where I interacted with that about it was an article that interacted with the guy who was just charged with a hate crime for destroying the statue of Satan at the Iowa State Capitol. And needless to say, I had to just turn off the comments because it was insane the amount of satanic support that came from the internet for that. But anyways, that's not what we're talking about today. But we want to know what your thoughts are as we interact with this. So today, Andrew, I sent this article to you because this is very relevant. Of course, if you're in our country and you follow any of the news, you realize that there has been an issue with our border. And essentially what has happened was we've been having a lot of people pouring across the border. It seems like our federal government has been aiding people to come across the border to the point of cutting wire and just having people come in. So recently, Texas has decided to deploy the National Guard and to stop the flow and continue to put wire there. Also, interestingly enough, the Supreme Court has at least just said that for now, the federal government can continue to cut wire. However, the Texas governor has said we're not stopping, and so keeping the National Guard there, more wire, more stuff, to where I've heard that they have really stemmed the tide. But the reason I bring that up is this is not meant to be a political conversation. This is wanting to be a theological conversation. And so I've stumbled upon an article that is called this. It says, "What the Texas border crisis teaches us about the Christian doctrine of the lesser magistrate." So, look, I guess, Andrew, but before we get started, obviously a conversation like this, I think in more of our circle, our theological circle, would mainly be more about like what we have talked about in the past about immigration or dealing with, what should we think about the border, that kind of a thing, and how we welcome people in or illegal immigrant. That's kind of typically how this goes. This is one, and this is what I really have been interested in, and you and I have been interested in this for a long time, actually since since about 2020. Um, but this idea, what's called the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, and is this connected? And is there maybe how can we view what's going on from a theological lens? Is I guess what I want to kind of explore. So I want us to look at this article by a guy named William Wolfe. As he's kind of walking through this, talking about it. So that's where I want to go today. I want to talk about the doctrine of lesser magistrate and see, does it apply here? And then is there something for us to be thinking about? Because I definitely did not grow up hearing about this at all um,
Yeah.
in churches, right?
Yeah, I mean, me neither. Of course, coming from a Baptist tradition, it's kind of already kind of dealing with a broken authority structure in the denomination. So we kind of are more kind of expecting a certain level of freedom and an ability to resist. But yeah, it is interesting. But you ready to pray, and then we can just kind of start working through it
Let's do it,
because
man.
forgot to pray on our last one, so I want to
I
make
know.
sure.
I remember you did.
Join me in the Lord's Prayer, if you will. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
So Okay, so let me kind of just start. Like we can put the article, and we'll put the article in the link for people to go and to look at. But I mean, here's the thing that's being set up. Essentially, what we're seeing here is that Texas has declared a state of invasion, and part of that is I think people need to understand. I think like most of the time when we look at this is people are we're not just seeing people who are coming for asylum. We also know that there's been plenty of people that have been picked up to where they actually mean harm for our country. And so for them, they're trying to step in and say that well, in fact, let's go to what Governor Abbott said. So this was that letter that he put out. And in his letter, said this: under President Biden's lawless border policies, more than 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years. That is more important. That is more than the population of 33 different states in this country.
Yeah,
This illegal refusal to protect the states have inflicted unprecedented harm on the people all across the United States. And then he goes on to say this: the failure of the Biden administration to fulfill the duties imposed by Article 4 has triggered Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which reserves the state to this state the right of self-defense. For these reasons, I've already declared an invasion. It goes on to say to invoke Texas constitutional authority to defend and protect itself, and the authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. The Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel are acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. So he has come out and said, the Biden administration has not done their job. We're going to do our job to protect Texas. That's essentially his argument that he's making. So once again, I don't want to weigh in on that piece necessarily. I want to weigh in on the theological piece, which is, does he have a right theologically? Because we do. I think it'd be important for us to bring in somebody at some point who can talk about the legal piece in American in an American context. But let's talk about that right of, is what he is doing, is there something theological to say about what he is doing? And that's where this article really takes the turn to say, let's talk about the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. So anything to say before I jump into that piece, and then let's have the discussion.
And I would say, and I know that you agree, the majority of these people aren't seeking to harm us. They're just economic migrants for the most part. Many are just looking for a better way of life, and the borders have been projected as open under this current administration.
Yeah.
And so, some are seeking harm. Some are hiding out and are nefarious, and some are genuine asylum seekers. The key is that we can't really, as a country, bring in this many. This is insanity. Full states. Multiple states, and then you have states where they're granting voting rights in local elections and things along those lines. So these people are actually displacing the citizens who are actually supposed to be here legally and born here. So it's something that no country can really sustain this type of movement. And so, I think it's interesting to see what Abbott is doing. And you are seeing a confrontation, which is somewhat made possible because of the broken structure of our state governments and federal governments and those types of things, that not every country is set up this way, especially Texas being very unique because they essentially have a clause where they can leave the country if the country lets them leave. It's a
of course.
Will it ever really happen? But we haven't seen a standoff like this to this degree, I don't believe, since the Civil War. So I think this is really interesting. Nobody's fighting each other at this point in time. It's just you're seeing states asserting their authority in such a way you haven't seen since the Civil War. And I think I heard someone weigh in that the major distinction between one view of the Civil War and the other is these are the United States, or this is the United States. And do we see ourselves as a collection of independent kingdoms or a collection of one nation? So very, very exciting and interesting things going forward, I think. But the doctrine of the lesser magistrate is a key doctrine, and it flows kind of out of a feudalistic understanding of the world, and maybe doesn't go far enough theologically, as I'm concerned. But I absolutely think it's a theological necessity, and it's worth talking about. But what is it? So do you want to kind of summarize what in the world this is?
Yeah. Okay. So in here they've got the explain what it is. I'm just going to quote what they say. It's a unique Christian theory of resistance to authority, which was first detailed at the Magdeburg Confession, or I don't know if you how you pronounce it. Is it Magdeburg Confession in 1550? The doctrine teaches that when a ruler has become an incorrigible tyrant with a very limited set of criteria, within a very limited set of criteria, he has abdicated his claim to legitimacy. Consequently, those magistrates with lesser authority under him may defy and resist the illegitimate magistrate and his unjust laws for the sake of protecting others. So that's it in a nutshell. So let me pause for just a second. Because, okay, clearly, and we've done stuff on this before on civil disobedience, that the Bible does teach that obedience to authority is not in the three spheres, right? We've talked about the family, the church, the government, that this is not something that is 100% blanket obedience in every sphere all the time. It's a general rule is that for the institution itself, we should be a people who obey, and that should be the relationship there. So we understand that, and as to largely to some extent, Christians, we understand. If you tell me I can't share the gospel, right? As Peter says, we must obey God rather than man, right? We get that piece, but beyond that, this is where I think it's important for us to kind of work through this, that there are other areas in which it's important for individuals to resist, and there are areas in which, it's okay for the lesser magistrate, the I guess I don't know the word I'd use is the lesser government or the smaller government to actually resist as well. So that's kind of the first piece of this, that there is more going on here than simply just people pushing back because there's something they've asked us to do that is that is not about the sharing the gospel or something like that. That there's actually more going into this, into what that should look like and when a government can have the right to push back. Any thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, I think so we're dealing with an authority that is underneath a higher authority, choosing to ignore the higher authority based upon principle or some sort of moral standard. And I would say that this really flows primarily from our understanding of God as the ultimate authority. And so this really doesn't work well in a non-Christian civilization. It can, because this devolves into anarchy, because you could argue that, okay, so anytime a leader disagrees with his boss, he could claim some sort of moral standard and then just refuse to follow orders. And so the reformers were very cautious of this because they were in fact breaking with the Catholic Church. And so they wanted to put these principles in place. This isn't haphazard, but really, if God is the ultimate authority, then we go back to Acts and we, judge for yourselves. Is it better to serve God or to serve men? And so when you feel like a magistrate would be requiring you to violate his law or to enact policy that de facto violates God's law in principle, violates your oath of office, so to speak. I'm called to protect and defend Texas, and the federal government is making that impossible if I follow the rules. You basically are saying there's ultimately a higher authority that I am obligated to follow. And so that really is the barrier here to keep someone from just enforcing their own wishes in violation of any type of authority. And that I think is one of the most important things that really, it's why it is a Christian doctrine. It is something that we do have to recognize. And it also should be very, very cautious. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, you can kind of see that was a rebellion of the lesser magistrate. The American Revolution was the Americans saying, we have been wronged so deeply by our magistrate, the king, that we must now break ties with this government and establish a whole new government. And it's basically make it official that we don't report to that authority anymore, and we'll set up a different set of authority because he's a tyrant. So the arguments that are put forth for that, many of them are based in Christian doctrine, or at least extension of Christian doctrine, that there is a higher power. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator. So without that understanding of God and his establishment of authority, we don't have a grounding really to ever disobey the authority above us. But it should not be haphazardly taken. We need to only break with that authority when we feel like doing so keeps us in the good graces of God and what he's called us to do. So, I think that's what we're seeing in Texas. He's saying, I have an oath to protect Texans, and that is I cannot be done unless I act in this way.
Yeah.
And so I cannot in good conscience not take action that is kind of, I don't know that he's violating specifically the Supreme Court's order, or just kind of saying, well, you do you and we'll do us, and not vacating and not necessarily fully letting it be enforced. I do think he's pushed the bounds where he probably is violating that order. But the truth is, I'm a little fuzzy on all the details of this because life's busy.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah, that's, I think, a really important thing for Christians, because you do get the crazies on all sides that start saying, well, we don't need any government and we don't need any authority. And that is, that's contrary to God's established justice. That's contrary to Romans 13 and other places as well.
Well, okay. So, I guess, when I think through this, there's two things for Christians to think through. First and foremost is, yes, that we must have in our minds a hierarchy of God's law trumps man's law. And if man's law comes in conflict with God's law, then we choose God's law over the man's law, right? That's the first piece. And so I think for all of us, we have to work through that in this issue of conscience too, that comes into play. Do I see this as trumping God's law? Now there will be some who will say, you know what, but that's a dangerous place to be in, right? Because what's to just have any group say, hey, I don't like like you brought up before, is this kind of anarchist approach. Well, that's where it comes at the end of the day, is like, we have to say, this is where I think we're having to get to, is there has to be an ultimate standard. And our federal government, the government itself is not the standard. It's not. And it can't be, because it shifts. I mean, you think about how much we shift and how quickly we shift, and what our priorities are and what's important to us. There is no lasting standing kind of morality. There is no lasting standing kind of approach to governing. And so there's got to be something stronger. That's why, I mean, truly, without some sort of without a faith in the behind this of what we have as a country, that's why a lot of places, they lean towards a dictatorship, because at least the rule of law is in one person's standard. He is the standard, and what he says goes. And I think there's that for some people is what becomes so comfortable, is because, at least we're not having that debate. I grew up in a monarchy overseas, and there was a lot of, at least the chaos was not there because the monarch ruled, and it was vested in himself. But without a moral code, without an understanding that God has to be behind it first, there's an issue. But in America, we also recognize that all of our government is supposed to be under the authority of the Constitution. And so if our government refuses to abide by the Constitution, because our allegiance, and we take our oath of office, right? When officials take their oath of office, they don't take it to a person, it's the Constitution. And so, for instance, the point that they're making in this article is, in the Constitution, it says in Article 4, Section 4, that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion. And so they're saying that if you're not going to do your job, then I remember before I even moved to Arizona years back, Arizona was dealing with this kind of stuff. That was the SB 1070 kind of stuff of like, okay, well, what are we going to do? We got to do something to help ourselves, since nobody else seems to be doing it. And so, I understand that in this case, they're seeing themselves as we have to defend or protect our people. And we should understand that they're there to do that. And if they're not going to do it from the top, we're going to have to take matters into our own hands. And so I think if you look at it from that perspective, I don't find anything wrong with that. Now, people are going to say, well, whatever legal argument, I'm just talking about from a theological argument of, is it wrong for a lesser magistrate to push back and to say, we will not do this? We're going to do something else, and especially if it's in something like to preserve life, so or to protect its citizens, then absolutely, So, but that also comes to and obviously when people look at Romans 13, one thing I try to point out to my congregation recently is like Romans 13:4 talks about that the government is God's servant for our good. It's not saying that every government is serving as God's good. It's that government in general, God uses as a servant, as a tool for his good. There are times when they're not doing that, though. And the hope is that he will use others to do that. So we do see examples, right? And I think that's important for us to think through. Do we see examples in Scripture where others will push back and not carry out something in defiance of governments? Can you think of, rattle off some that you can think of?
Yeah. I mean, I'll save the Samuel one for you since you're the OT guy. But the whole expansion of the church in the New Testament is constantly confronted with. Paul is beaten by a magistrate illegally, and he doesn't produce his citizenship paper until afterwards. He actually uses that to create an offense so that he can further the gospel. So he's very clever about that. And then they say, well, we'll get you out of town secretly. And he says, no, you're gonna announce this, and you're gonna escort me out of town. And so he was able to use law and government to his favor in that. But he was ordered, not to preach the gospel. The apostles were ordered. The local Jewish leaders in the synagogues. There were different layers where they were being forced to say, I will not follow what you have given. And the early church, of course, ordered by other religious groups and the government. It's not just a matter of broken separate spheres, but you get fights within the spheres. That's really what we're talking about with the lesser magistrate. But you do run into those situations where people are deciding not to obey, not to comply, or to and that can be a positive as well as a negative. I can not comply by positively acting in such a way, or I cannot comply by refusing to act as commanded. So I think you see that in just the general growth of the gospel. But yeah, we do have some other passages where we see this, where it seems to be commended, even though it may not necessarily be prescriptive. I mean, I'm thinking of the Samuel passage. You want to share that
No,
one?
you go ahead. I'll throw out a different one too. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we have the passage where Saul has been hunting down David, and he comes after the priests who essentially were helping hide David. And 1 Samuel 22:17, the king ordered the guards at his side, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. So the king ordered Doeg, and he goes ahead and he does it. So what was right there? It doesn't say, hey, Doeg should be commended because he obeyed the king's order, and it doesn't say that the king's officials were in the right. But I think everybody reading this passage would feel a similar sorrow and allegiance, perhaps, with where the officials went. We're not going to kill the priests. That's not. This group can't even fight in war. We can't even count the priests. Clearly, this would be a violation, and the king can't order the destruction of the priests. But Doeg did, and he could say, "I was just following orders." So that's the kind of thing that you see throughout Scripture and basically in church history and church life. That there have been times where you cannot comply with an unjust order. Because the reality is it's a violation against God. And we went in our religious liberty discussion. If I feel like it's a violation of God and I'm wrong, I still can't violate my conscience. What I needed is to inform my conscience. and we can chase this rabbit a little bit later, but we sometimes run into situations where it doesn't have to be a situation where I rebel against the command. I may choose to yield my office. So sometimes you can take a passive approach to this and say, I won't resist the higher magistrate, but what I'll do is I'll yield this office, and maybe somebody else who's got better insight about this can take over.
Yeah.
And so that could be a cowardly approach, and it could also be a wise approach depending on the situation. So.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think for all of us, we just need to be mindful and to work through, as Christians, look for those examples in which we see that that people will push back against the government, and to recognize that that everything that we get, it's not as clear cut that everything the government tells us to do, we must do, and to just to keep that in mind. Now, here's what's interesting for us, right? Because we're having this as an individualistic conversation, but there are others who need to recognize that maybe God has placed them in a position of government, and they're going to have to weigh how do they function, and I think you have to keep in mind who are you ultimately. If you're in government, you are to view yourself as ultimately a servant to of God to do good, right? And He is the one in which you work for Him. And so that's where this becomes more of a difficult conversation, because it's easy for you and I to have this conversation as individuals and say, okay, well, I'll do this or I'll do that. But where the rubber meets the road is if you actually have authority, and then you're going to have to weigh and you're going to have to look. But there's enough here. And this doctrine, by the way, has been formalized in church history. It becomes more of a conversation about the 1500s. John Knox is one who wrote extensively on it as well. I will say this: it appears, and some people have said, okay, well, why is it that we've not had so much of a conversation about this more recently? Why is it that largely we've not thought about this or talked about this? And it might very well be that in America, for to some extent, we've had prosperity, we've had peace, we've had freedom of religion, and so it's you've not had to talk about this when there hasn't been any issue to deal to a dust up at all. But here we are now. We're having to think through this stuff. I'll say this, I think this is the same conversation. People on both sides of the spectrum, right? Political spectrum. I think we'd have to agree that, in some respect, we do think like this, right? Where I think about, was it years back when we were doing sanctuary cities? And there were some on that side said, no, we have every right to not go with what the government's saying. And that was on one side, on the left. And then you had the sanctuary county people who are saying, okay, whatever the state says, we're going to do this. We're not enforcing these things. And so, I feel like this is something that whether you're on the left or on the right, whether you agree with that this is an invasion or not, that there is some room to have this conversation of what is good and what is right and moral, and where is that line? What does that look like? It should not be arbitrary. It should not be subjective. It needs to come from a place of for the Christian, as we think about it, we should be seeking, say, is this against God's law? And how does that work in this mode in which I find myself leading, right? So anyways, yeah, so I'm just kind of walking through this. I think it's an interesting thing to pursue. I think it's something to continue to talk about. It is something that people are talking about right now. I will say this. I feel like one of the ways in which I've seen this begin to take shape and come back is prior to 2020, the way that we were seeing this conversation come back up was over the abortion issue. People saying, when are governments going to stand in the gap for the preborn, right? When are they going to finally say, you have said this, but we're not going this route? And that's where people have been writing about this for years already, saying, at some point, someone should, the lesser magistrate should step in and say, this is what we're going to do. But I do think it's important. I think this checks and balances kind of thing from a theological standpoint of how God looks at governments and how we use them is a worthwhile conversation to think through. So I don't know. That's all I got. Like I said, just kind of interacting with this article and seeing what he says. But like I said, I think it's worth a conversation. I think it's worth churches thinking through, pastors thinking through as well. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons our founders set our government up the way that they set it up was so that you could have competing layers of authority and separated branches of authority, so that you would have kind of more stopping points to check total abuse of power. And that was some of the brilliance of our government, but it also made it weak. And one of the reasons Americans are infighting so much is because of those inherent weaknesses in the system. But that was to make sure that tyranny was always checked. And that is, I think, one of the wonderful things about our system, even though it's a little messy. And I think as Baptists, we have similar things like that in our own authority, where the king of the church is typically the pastor or an elder board of some kind, but they report to the congregation. But no church body above them can order them to comply with certain things or not. They have autonomy. So Baptists, I don't think we've thought of this as often because we kind of have a broken view of authority anyway. And we usually kind of carry it down to the level of the individual. I think it's weak for us to not recognize, though, the authority structures that God has established. And a doctrine like this is also helpful in maybe gaining some respect for the importance of authority in the lives of people at all of the spheres. Yes, as a pastor of a church, that carries a certain level of authority, and the people in the church should follow the teaching of their pastor, right? Not just their favorite YouTube preacher, but there's an authority in the office. And unless that pastor is teaching false doctrine, generally we should have a disposition to obey. And the government, we should generally have a disposition to obey based upon how they are governing according to what God has decreed. I think the breakdown that we're seeing right now is that there is no agreed standard of God's law in our country. And so people are kind of emotionally cherry picking issues such as the sanctuary city issue. To defy federal law, sanctuary cities, when it comes to marijuana use, to defy federal law because of some greater good is really great harm in not having recreational use of marijuana that requires a violation of the federal government there. And that doesn't usually get talked about in the media because of biases in our own system of what gets talked about and what gets discussed. But it's one of those things that we are, I think Arizona is in violation of federal law when it comes to its sanctioning of marijuana use. That, in my mind, is not justified violation. But it's not talked about because it's kind of a lower level deal. And I think the thought is enough states are just going to ignore federal law there that the federal government will move on it. Well, that's a form of lesser magistrate, kind of obstinately ignoring the higher magistrate. So we do see this, and sometimes it's a big deal, and sometimes it's a smaller deal. It really should be a big deal in my mind to defy the authority above, based upon what God has said in Romans 13. And it applies again to all spheres. So if I was to order my wife to do something that was against God's law, she, as the lesser magistrate in my household, should disobey. And if I was going to do something unjust to my children or against God's law to my children, she should stand in the gap and defy my command, right? And that type of thing is something that we don't always think about, but that the spheres hold true. And it is something that we really should look at. And if the lesser magistrates are doing their job, when you hear these horrible stories of giant churches and pastors who've been operating in unethically and immorally, where was the whistleblower? Where was the one that was kind of standing up to protect this person from the people? So there is a righteous call for someone in this lesser magistrate role to act justly in their role to the people beneath them. And that puts them in a dangerous spot. A lot of times lesser magistrates get executed in church history and in history. But it does bring enough attention to an issue that it can stop. So I think it's really important. I'm glad that you brought it up. Again, we're not trying to get terribly political, but we should think about these things because in a world that has no standard, it's going to happen more and more. And how are we as a people of God to say we will respect authority until it's time to respect only the higher authority because we are in contradiction?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's like if you're going to defy authority, you better be very sure of yourself, right? You better be sure that that the reason for doing this is because it is. And I think, in America, you're I think we have to think through two things. Either A, it is against God's, right? Okay. B, it's if we can't make the case that it's against God, is it against our Constitution, right? And that's another area that I think that we have a unique experience being in a country like this, and we have that. Question is, do we actually know what's in it to know what it says? So, first and foremost, I think every Christian should know what's in the Bible, live like that. But we should also be recognizing, what does it actually say to live here? What does our Constitution say? What does that mean for us? But anyways, yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and I think it's worth examining. Some of the reason we want to do this is just because it's current. It's a current event, and it's something that I think most people are just talking from the perspective of about what do we do about the illegal immigrants and all of that, and not so much does how should we judge the actions of what's going on with this governor, and is there biblical precedent? So I think this is important for us to look at, and to have a talk through, because I think this is not the end of this. As you've rightly said,
Right.
we expect to see more of this, and it's going to have to be us evaluating, is this a righteous response or not?
Well, one of the things too is that as Christians, we should not be quick to defy. Like you said, we got to be careful. A lot of times we have time, and you read the Declaration of Independence, they'll talk about how many times they've tried to appeal and rectify. So Governor Abbott did not do this on day one. He's let 6 million people. He's waited for the Biden administration to act. And now he said, okay, it's too far. We have to do something. So there have been efforts made. There has been a certain amount of time that he now feels justified in saying enough is enough. We must act. You may disagree or not. But I think that's another thing, is that not every decision needs to be spur of the moment. I have to act. Sometimes you're pressed to that, kill those priests. No, I can't do that. I'm going to defy you here and now. But sometimes we would have something like, okay, we think there's medical benefits to a certain drug that the federal government is restricting. Okay, well, what are the appropriate channels to try to change that so that we can open up some avenues? That probably doesn't need to be performed in a rebellion against the government. Initially, so, and of course, people would disagree with me on that, but that's the key in this. I think is really careful, considered leaders. You've got to work your part in this, and then explore all of the avenues for your petition, right? Because we respect authority. And at the end of the day, when all of that is ignored, you've got to do what's right, as far as you and God and the responsibility he's given you to. So, yeah, I would pray that we'd have godly, courageous leaders who would step into this role for a host of issues. But on the other side, I think that we need to encourage our own church members and people that listen to this, that God is a God who established authority structure. And it is a very severe thing just to take the authority he's placed over you and cast it aside haphazardly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well said. Way to end it, man. I think you're right. Yeah, I hope nobody's understanding as we're leaving here that we're just saying willy-nilly defy authority and just slap a religious reason on it, which might be a critique. No, it's a fearful thing to go against the servant of God, which was what he has set up, his authority structure on the earth in that way. So anyways, you ready to close us out?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
All right.
May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look with favor on you and give you peace. Guys, thanks for listening. And hey, I hope we could do this again soon. Get back on it, man.
And if this made you mad, smash that like button right there and share it
That
with your
would be
friends and
great.
family.
That would be great. Hey, thanks for watching, guys. We'll talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.